She was an empire of logic. He was the chaos she couldn't calculate. High Archon Lyra Vex sat upon the suspended dais of the Ethelgard, her posture a rigid line of geometry that matched the brutalist architecture of the flagship. Her people, the Vexian ascendancy, did not fidget. They did not slouch. And they certainly did not feel the atmospheric temperature drop 3 degrees just because a single human walked into the room. But as Commander Kalen Vance stepped into the circle of judgment, the bioluminescent scales along Lyra's neck flickered from a composed violet to a startled soft indigo. She told herself it was a system error. Commander Vance looked terrible, honestly. His uniform was singed at the cuffs, and there was a smudge of grease high on his cheekbone that he seemed blissfully unaware of. He didn't stand at attention the way the galactic protocols demanded. He stood easy, like he was waiting for a bus rather than a verdict that could space him. 14 minutes to deliberate, 6 minutes to die, one choice to change history. That was the Vexian way. The clock projected on the retinal display of every guard in the room was ticking down, but Kalen was busy looking around the throne room with a mild, inquisitive frown. Archon Lyra tapped her clawed finger against the armrest, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silence. "Commander Vance," she intoned, her voice synthesized into a perfect, harmonious chord that usually made lesser species void their bladders. "You stand accused of violating Protocol 7 Delta. You drain the Ethelgard's auxiliary reserves to power the life support of a Class C civilian transport. And that energy was designated for the siege cannon. Explain the variable that led to this error." Kalen blinked, finally focusing on her. He didn't look terrified. He looked disappointed? No, that wasn't it. He looked like a parent whose child had just asked why they couldn't eat ice cream for breakfast. "It wasn't a variable, Archon," Kalen said, his voice raspy. "Truth is, it wasn't even a choice. The transport had kids on board. Their scrubbers were failing. I didn't run a cost-benefit analysis. I just gave them the juice." Lyra's primary heart stuttered against her ribs, a sensation so foreign she almost signaled for a medic. This was the phenomenon her advisors warned about: Terran empathy. It was inefficient, it was dangerous, and standing this close to it made her sensory ganglia buzz with a static that felt suspiciously like heat. "Yeah, you compromised the strategic advantage of this vessel," Lyra countered, though the harmonious chord of her voice wavered, just a fraction. "For biological units that offer zero tactical value?" Kalen shifted his weight, and the silence stretched. He wasn't looking at her rank insignia or the terrifying height of the dais. He was looking at her hands, specifically the way her fine, crystalline fingers were clenched tight against the throne. "Look, I know how this looks on a spreadsheet," Kalen said, stepping forward. The guards tensed, weapons rising, but Lyra didn't order them to fire. She was too busy analyzing the sudden spike in her pheromone receptors. He smelled like ozone, stale coffee, and something distressingly warm. "Honestly, Archon, you look stressed. Are those tremors?" Lyra stiffened. Oh, the micro vibrations in her carapace were a sign of extreme computational load, not weakness. But before she could correct him, the human did the unthinkable. He shrugged off his heavy thermal-lined flight jacket. It was a clumsy, purely human movement, a shuffle of shoulders and a tug of fabric. He bunched the garment in his hands and took another step, disregarding the energy barrier that separated the judge from the condemned. The barrier should have fried him. Instead, it flickered and died, unable to reconcile the lack of hostility in his biosignature. He was judged for saving lives, pardoned for stealing a heart, or at least, that's what the historians would eventually say. In the moment, it was just a tired man offering a coat to a woman he thought looked cold. "Here," Kalen said, extending the jacket. "It's freezing in here. You guys run these ships efficient, but man, you sacrifice comfort." Lyra stared at the battered leather item hovering before her. It was illogical. Her physiology was designed to withstand the vacuum of space. She did not need thermal insulation from a primate. Yet as the heat radiating from the jacket hit her sensory pits, her secondary heart slammed into a rhythm that matched the human's pulse. It was a biological breach, an invasion of the most intimate kind. She should have executed him. The timer on the wall hit the 6-minute mark. Protocol demanded a sentence. Instead, the most powerful woman in the galaxy just asked for his frequency code. It wasn't a verbal request. It was a data burst, a discrete packet of encryption sent directly from her neural link to his comms unit. A private channel, a tether. "Take your seat, Commander," Lyra whispered, the synthesizer dropping away to reveal her true organic voice, a sound like wind moving through glass. "We will discuss the logistics of your empathy, but keep the jacket. If I accept it, I am acknowledging a dependency, and I am not dependent." Kalen smiled, and the expression crinkled the corners of his eyes in a way that made Lyra's internal tactical display flash a warning. "Danger, defenses compromised." "Suit yourself, Archon," he said, draping the jacket back over his shoulder. "But the offer stands. We humans are stubborn like that." The Drossic fleet didn't broadcast a declaration of war. They simply rewrote the vacuum with high-yield thermal signatures. On the bridge of the Ethelgard, the air tasted like ozone and static as the Drossic algorithmic targeting locked onto the Vexian flagship with a precision that was, frankly, terrifying. But Lyra wasn't looking at the tactical displays. She was looking at the small glowing icon on her private HUD, the frequency code she had illicitly secured from the human. "Archon," Kalen's voice crackled through the encrypted link, sounding impossibly calm despite the muffled thud of distant impacts. "Truth is, your computers are playing a game of chess while the Drossic are playing a game of chicken. If you keep following the retreat and recharge protocol, they'll have your shields down in 3 minutes. You need to do something they haven't calculated for." Lyra's scales turned a sharp, defensive crimson. "I cannot authorize a breach of formation, Commander. My officers rely on the predictability of the Ascendancy's doctrine." "Then let me do it," he said. "I mean, I'm already a criminal, right? Hey, give me a skirmisher in 4 minutes. I'll break their lock." It was a risk that defied every tenet of cross-cultural leadership dynamics. To trust a human instinct over Vexian math was to invite a slow death by administrative review, or a fast one by plasma fire. But as the bridge shuddered under another salvo, Lyra looked at the empty seat beside her and felt a sudden, sharp ache in her primary heart that had nothing to do with gravity. "Do it," she whispered. She watched on the long-range scanners as a single tiny ship broke from the hangar, not in a defensive arc, but in a reckless, screaming dive straight into the heart of the Void Maelstrom. It was a maneuver that should have torn the hull apart. It was chaotic, it was messy, it was purely, bafflingly human. The Drossic targeting scrambled. Well, the algorithms couldn't account for a pilot who ignored the physics of momentum in favor of a hunch. The siege broke, the enemy fleet falling into a confused retreat as their precision turned into a liability. But victory came with a price. A stray kinetic shell slammed into the Ethelgard's dorsal spine, and the bridge supports groaned and buckled. Lyra didn't have time to calculate the trajectory of the falling debris. She simply watched the massive durasteel beam descend toward her, the logic of her mind accepting the inevitable collision. Then the world turned into heat and the smell of worn leather. Kalen hadn't stayed in the skirmisher. He had docked, sprinted, and somehow reached the bridge just as the world fell apart. He didn't use a localized shield or a gravity tether. He simply threw his body over hers, or his arms locking around her crystalline torso, pulling her into the hollow of his chest. The impact of the beam hit the floor inches away, but the shock wave threw them across the deck. Lyra gasped, her sensory pits overwhelmed by the sheer, terrifying proximity of him. His skin was burning, not with fever, but with that intense, radiating human warmth. Her dual hearts began to sync with his rapid, thudding pulse, a biological symphony that shouldn't have been possible between two different worlds. "Are you okay?" Kalen stammered, his breath warm against her neck. He didn't let go. His hands were shaking, but his grip was a sacred pact. Lyra looked up at the jagged metal above them, then back at the man who had prioritized her survival over his own structural integrity. She felt a shift in her own biology, a rapid cooling of her scales that signaled a complete and total surrender of her Vexian composure. "I am functioning," she managed, her voice a soft, unamplified chime. "But your physiology is compromised. You are leaking red fluid." Kalen laughed, a dry, ragged sound. "It's just a scratch, Archon. I told you, we're stubborn." The bridge was silent now, save for the crackle of short-circuiting consoles and the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the two people on the floor. The High Council was watching. The guards were frozen. The ancient traditions of the Vexian ascendancy demanded she push him away, cite a violation of personal space, and return to the cold, hard logic of her station. Instead, Lyra reached out and placed her hand over his, her fingers interlacing with his human ones. She felt the texture of his skin, the ridges, the calluses, the delicate complexity of his touch. Navigating high-stakes negotiation through unyielding conviction was one thing. Doing it through a public declaration of affection was another. But as Lyra stood, she didn't release his hand. She pulled him up with her, facing the gathered remains of her command with a violet glow of pride that could be seen from the observation deck. "The Vexian Order has always sought perfection in silence," Lyra announced, her voice echoing through the ship's comms. "But today, we were saved by a beautiful, necessary noise. I am declaring a new protocol." She looked at Kalen, the man who had stolen her heart while she was busy judging his. "From this moment on, the Ascendancy will not just calculate," Lyra said, her scales shimmering in a kaleidoscope of affection. "We will learn to feel, and Commander Vance will be the one to teach us." Kalen leaned in close, his shoulder brushing hers in a way that made her internal processors crash in the best possible way. "Honestly, Archon, I think you're already a natural."